Today, I have a story about what it was like to be a woman working in the United States when I was younger up till about now. Welcome to English Coach 3Ts. I'm Tanya, and this story has a lot of different parts that play into it. But I'm going to start with something my grandmother said to me when I decided to study architecture in college. In the United States, we say we are going to college when we mean we're going to the university. And my grandmother was not happy at all that I had decided to study architecture. At that time, and also in that part of the United States, it was much more common for women to study things like becoming a teacher, maybe a nurse, something like that. And in my grandma's eyes, or in my grandma's opinion, studying architecture was not a good thing for a woman to do. In fact, she said to me that it was going to ruin my life. And it kind of makes me laugh a little, only because, of course, it did not ruin my life. In her mind, she felt like there would be, in fact, she said, no man will ever want to marry you if you become an architect. Now, this isn't representative of all the United States or of all the people in the United States, but it does show you that there are different ways of thinking for different people in different areas, and it did exist and still exists in different parts of the United States. I do think it has changed over time. You might say it has gotten better or it has become more equal. I don't know if equal is the word. Maybe you could say it has become more appropriate. But I'm just going to focus on my story and how I experienced this. So when I went to school to become an architect, in the entire freshman class, which would be the first year of architecture, I was one of only 2 women in the whole class. I don't know how many young men there were, but I would guess probably somewhere between 50 and 70 young men and 2 young women. This really wasn't a problem. It just was unusual to be the only women in the class. And now that I think about it, I actually started my education in interior design. And one of my teachers told me, even if you want to be an interior designer, as a woman, you really should get a degree in architecture, and then you can practice interior design. Basically, what she was saying is, as a woman, you need more education than a man does, even if you want to do something that doesn't require that much education. I did decide to get my degree in architecture, and I really enjoyed studying architecture. After I graduated, I got my first professional job in a very small firm, a very small office, where I was the only woman who was there practicing and working in architecture. We did have a secretary in the office who was a woman, and one of the things that might have really upset other young women was that of all of the people in the firm, when something needed to be done that the secretary needed to do, but the secretary wasn't there, they asked me to do that even though there were other people. Now, it could have been because I was the only woman. It could have been because I was the youngest. It also could have been because I was the most recently hired. Probably being a woman played into it, but it probably wasn't the only reason. However, there were a lot of things that were unfair and would actually be considered illegal to say and do in the United States at that time, and for sure at this time. One of the people who was my boss at the time had a strong opinion about whether or not women should be architects. In fact, he straight out said to me, women should not be architects. This is considered discrimination and is not tolerated in the United States workforce. Now, it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it shouldn't happen, and you could take legal action. There was more to it than that. For example, all the other people in the firm were given business cards, and I was told that I should pay for my own business cards because women shouldn't be architects. And there was actually some sexual harassment that was happening at the time. That's a huge story. It was not a good thing. It was very disrespectful, and a lot of people thought that I should take it to court at the time. There's more than one reason why I didn't, but one of the things I really want to be sure and point out is that all of the other men in the office were very respectful to me as a woman working in the same environment, doing the same type of work, and actually learning to do what they did, since I was the most recently hired person. In fact, the discrimination and the harassment got to be so bad that I started to work from home, which at this time, not quite 30 years ago, was not at all common. We didn't have internet, but I could use my drafting tools and work at home and not have to be a part of all of the negative behavior that was happening there. Unfortunately, it didn't work for me to work from home. The harassment just continued even though I wasn't in the office. And eventually I decided to pursue other work. This is one of those stories where something that seemed like it was a bad thing at the time, in fact, it felt like it was a really bad thing. I had spent a lot of time and a lot of money on an education that was turning out to not work out so well for me. However, I was outside of my apartment at the time playing basketball, just shooting some hoops and getting some exercise by myself, when a gentleman walked by and struck up a conversation with me. We started talking about what I did for a living, and it turned out that his son owned a business that hired people to work with young girls in the behavioral health industry. This was something I was very interested in, things like psychology and social work, and probably would not be able to get a job in that field if I didn't have a connection, since my education was in architecture, not in social work or psychology. However, I did get a job in that business through this gentleman that I happened to meet out playing basketball, and I worked my way up through that business until another unfortunate thing happened that really had nothing to do with being a woman in the workforce. At that time, I started teaching privately, teaching art and piano, and the rest is really history, because from that point, I realized, or I guess you could say I already knew, but it really solidified the fact for me that I loved teaching, and it turned out to be the perfect career for me. From that place, I built my career and was able to work it in with my family, with my children, with all of the other goals that I had in my life and still have in my life. Over the years, spending time with my daughters and their friends and watching what happens in the news and in the different things that I've read and learned, I do think that things have changed a little in what it's like to be a woman working in the United States. There are still a lot of things that are not necessarily fair. However, I would say that is true in both directions. But again, to keep the focus on me, currently, as you know, I work for myself. So mostly for me, this is no longer an issue. The topic of whether or not men and women are equal is a popular topic in the news and in conversations. But putting all of that aside, I think it's pretty safe to agree that men and women are not exactly the same, and we do have some different needs. This is one of the reasons I've created a fluency program especially made to meet the needs of women with an intermediate to advanced level of English. If this is you, I'd like to invite you to my free class, 3 Secrets to Becoming Fluent Without Wasting Time and Without Doing Things That Don't Work. You can sign up for free at the link you'll find in the description below. My hope is that all people would be treated fairly, no matter what their race, gender, religion, age, and so forth. I'm curious if this is something that is similar in your country, and what do you think the differences are between how people in your country are treated in the workforce and people here in the United States? One of the very best ways to learn English in general, and especially so that you can learn vocabulary and phrases and remember them, is to listen to stories just like this one. If you're ready to watch another story, I suggest you give this one a try, and I'll see you there.